just going to say something really short about the turnout at the early ballots this weekend, because apparently it was really large. But if you do all that, I'll do that.
Just a few minutes.
Yeah, and then I'll say what I like my short bit about the early ballot, and then introduce the speakers.
Okay, so that'll flow nice. There's something over here.
Ready?
Okay, I'm taking the short link. Welcome, everyone.
Oh, this? Yeah. Yeah.
All right, well, Theo gets that organized. Welcome, everyone, to our fourth Elbows Up Toronto meeting. Thank you all for being here. I'm Linda McDonald. I'm a member of the steering committee for Elbows Up Toronto. We do have a group. You see Theo and I up in front, but there's a lot of people working behind the scenes that deserve a lot of credit. And my co-chair.
I'm Theo, and I'm also on the steering committee and up at the front.
Okay, I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So this is where I always like to pause for a moment and just let people contemplate, those aren't just words, they mean something to all of us. So we'll take a moment to think about that, and then we'll get on with the agenda. Thank you. So as I said, this is our fourth meeting. We've come together to kind of find a way to work as a community in Toronto. And we've had a number of speakers at those previous meetings. We've had former mayors of Toronto. We've had people come in who are very expert in certain areas. And what we're hoping that people are taking away from this is information that helps them understand what does the threat from the US mean to Canada and to Toronto. Not just as to the country, but what does it mean to us as individuals? And coming out of that, what can we do, either individually or collectively? And we're hoping that this knowledge, people say knowledge is power, that's what we're hoping, is that by spreading this knowledge with people, that we're helping to inspire you, to help you create your own groups, and to know better what the best way is for you to respond, and also to help us feel that collectively we're not by ourselves in this conversation. So our group, Elbows Up, started off very small, started with an email. One person sent one email to 70 people, and it turned into all of this. So you can make a difference. And the nice thing about this is that we know that we're not alone. We know that Americans are standing up. The 50-51, don't know if that's how they say it, but 50 states, 50 protests, one day, have been very active. They've already had 4 days instead of 1 day. And then Elbows Up Canada, which has been bringing people together in different cities across Canada, has a meeting coming up on April 26th in Sault Ste. Marie. So they are also bringing people together. So it's a real collective across the country. We're going to have a series of speakers this evening. I'm going to let Theo say a few words, and then we'll get on to our speakers.
So I'm just going to start off by talking about, we kind of like to start the meeting by talking about how we can see this moment not just as a challenge, but as an opportunity. And a really good example of that was over the weekend. I don't know if you guys heard, but CBC reported that 2 million people made it out to vote on the Friday. Yeah. So that's a record in Canada, and I think it was 36% more than the 2021 federal election. And that kind of shows the opportunity of this moment, is that a lot of people have seen what's happened in the US and how democracy is under threat there. And it's a lot harder to take democracy for granted when you do kind of have that firsthand view into the threats to democracy. So I think that is a really positive step for Canada and shows that people are really taking this moment quite seriously. And one of the funny parts of the article that I thought was great is that everyone was celebrating how long they had to wait in line to vote, saying, I waited 2 hours to vote. How great is this? Everyone's making it out to vote. And maybe shows a lot about Canadians and a lot about how much, I guess, pride there is in what's happening in Canada right now. So yeah, I thought that was a funny way of looking at waiting in a line for 2 hours, and quite a good way of looking at it. And with that, so I'm going to introduce our first two speakers, and they're going to speak, and then at the end of the first two speakers, we're going to have questions, and then later on, John Rolston-Saul will be giving his speech. So our first speaker is Doug Saunders. Doug Saunders is the Globe and Mail's international affairs columnist. He has been a writer with the Globe since 1995 and has extensive experience as a foreign correspondent, having run the Globe's foreign bureaus in Los Angeles and London. He will be speaking on borders and the Safe Third Country Agreement. Our second speaker will be Elizabeth Renzetti. Elizabeth Renzetti is a best-selling Canadian-British author and journalist, a teacher, advocate, and public speaker. Until recently, Elizabeth worked for the Globe and Mail, where she wrote a popular opinion column and feature stories. She has won the Landsberg Award for reporting on gender issues. Elizabeth will be speaking on Women in Trump's America. So, Doug, yeah. Would you like that?
Thank you, everybody, for coming out on this Monday evening. Please raise your hands or make some symbol if I'm speaking too quickly or not clearly enough for this very echoey church. I'd like to talk to you about the weaponization of the border. And I think we've heard that phrase used before to describe what the United States has done to borders and what other countries have done to borders. Build the wall and make Mexicans pay for it, all that sort of thing. It's surprising, even in the context of this administration in the United States, to be speaking very literally and seriously about the weaponization of the Canadian border. And I'm going to talk about the three things that means and what we can do about it. It's a little shocking that you can get a few floors up into any building in Toronto and you can see that imaginary line halfway through the lake. And to imagine that a little more than 10 years ago, we were very close to making that line even more imaginary. We had reached a situation where goods and services and investment could move largely freely across that border and the one to the south. And we were very close in 2013, 2014, around there, to taking the next logical step and having relatively free movement of labor, of people across that border. The administrations of Canada and the United States met several times to try to negotiate something along the lines of a European-style free border movement pact. And in fact, in the 2015 election, there were promises from the Liberals to try to negotiate deeper integration between our countries and make the border more imaginary than it was. And it seemed, until very recently, like that was the natural course of things. And indeed, it might be during some of our lifetimes, but for the moment, things have gone very dramatically in the opposite direction. We are now in a situation where the border is being used against us and where policies by the Trump administration are being used to try to get us to weaponize our border against ourselves and against the people we should be welcoming into Canada. We've heard a lot, and in fact this election is being fought over the way the border has been weaponized economically, about the tariff threats, the economic threats of movement of goods and services across the border, the sovereignty threats, which, however rhetorical they may be, are worrisome in the hands of somebody who might, late at night, piqued by some political slight, decide to pick up the phone and ask them to send a raid across the border to arrest someone, and then have that escalate. Suddenly we're worried about what's moving across the border. So the three ways that Trump and his circle have weaponized our border, first is in creating a fictional border threat and trying to get us to turn it against us. From day one, in fact, from his inauguration speech, he claimed that the Canadian border was a threat to the United States. He claimed that fentanyl was entering the United States from Canada, that so-called illegal immigrants were entering the United States from Canada, and used this to place demands on Canada. In fact, that remains his sole rationale for the tariffs that do exist on Canada, and the even worse ones that may be imposed, is that there is some sort of threat. He declared an emergency in the United States as if there was some sort of military invasion or something. I don't think I need to tell anybody here that is completely fictional. That although Canada does have a problem with fentanyl manufacturing and sales, it's purely domestic. It's sold to Canadians. The US border services have pointed out in their more candid admissions that it makes no economic sense for any bike gang or criminal organization to make something like fentanyl in Canada for export to the United States. It would cost the gangs twice as much and that sort of thing. And I think we found that of the 40,000 pounds of fentanyl that had entered the United States across international border, something like 40 pounds of it had come from Canada. But then a further investigation by some of my colleagues found that 40 pounds probably, in fact, did not come from Canada and never crossed the border and so on. So the most likely number is 0 or something very close to it. Same with the problem with migrants, even to the extent that they are a problem. There have been cases of people flying to Canada so they could walk into the United States. But the numbers are tiny. I mean, they're a fraction of 1% of the movement across in the other direction, and they're not particularly a threat. Nevertheless, the demand for Canada to address this imaginary threat in order to prevent the tariffs from being imposed was taken seriously in January. Prime Minister Trudeau did respond by promising to spend $1.3 billion on a border security plan that included new jet helicopters to patrol the border, and by appointing a so-called border czar, or fentanyl czar, depending on how you put it. None of this was necessary. Nobody in Ottawa thinks any of it was necessary. I think you could be a little bit sympathetic in saying that the tariffs would be so devastating to Canada's economy and existence that it might have seemed politically expedient to do so. And it was done. And the tariffs were still imposed. So we learned that lesson, that we don't need to weaponize our border against ourselves as a bargaining move that's never going to be answered rationally. So the tariffs exist for no particular reason, and we still have a lot of border security that we don't need for no particular reason. The second way that Trump and his circle have weaponized the border, and all the borders of North and Central America, is by causing a huge increase in the populations who are stuck on the road. The number of people who are rendered stateless by political circumstances in countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, in other countries of the world, and now by the United States. We already were in a situation where the countries of North America were trying to work together to do something for the more than 8 million Venezuelans who've been forced onto the road by the collapse of their state, by the more than 1 million Haitians who are forced onto the road, the many other populations who are drifting between countries and so on. Many have been settled in other places. A small proportion of those stateless populations made it to the United States. Very small proportion, still numbering in the hundreds of thousands, but it was a country with huge labor shortages, with full employment. They weren't a problem. And they had no choice but to come to the United States because of policy decisions that I won't get into that basically made it necessary to physically come to the US border if you wanted to apply for asylum. You couldn't effectively do it on the road, and you couldn't apply for other ways of entering other than asylum. Now, these hundreds of thousands of people in the United States are under threat. Their legal residency status is under threat. Their right under the United Nations Convention to apply for asylum in the United States is under threat, and the preparations are being made for mass deportations. And the stories we've been hearing about giant prisons in Central America and this sort of thing are just the beginning. The ambitions of this administration are to cause hundreds of thousands of people to be forced to leave or to self-deport. And many of them will have no choice but to come to Canada because the physical security on the southern border, Mexico is not welcoming people, Guatemala is not welcoming people. There are no easy ways to return. Deportation, i.e. putting people on a plane and flying them to another country, can be done to maybe a few hundred people a week at best, even under a big regime. Many, many people will have to leave physically if their security is in danger. If the United States has become a country where people living there have a well-founded fear of persecution, to quote the United Nations Convention on the Refugees. Which brings us to our third way of weaponizing the border, which is through the unintended use of a treaty known as the Safe Third Country Agreement, which you've probably all heard of. It was created in the years after September 11th as a way to regulate refugee flows, mainly politically because of US concerns about people coming from Canada into the United States. But it's been used in many ways. But it basically says that if you've applied for asylum in the United States, or in fact, realistically, if you've set foot in the United States, you can't come to Canada. You can't apply for asylum in Canada, with some exceptions that people don't know about. And it was already causing problems because it meant that if you wanted to go from the United States to Canada, or if physical circumstances in the United States, or political circumstances, or fear of persecution in the United States forced you to come to Canada, you could not present yourself at a legal border crossing, you could not present yourself at a Canadian consulate, you could not make an application by mail or online. Your only option was to cross the border between crossing points and lodge an application at some point after that, at which point the Canadian Constitution kicks in, which gives anybody physically in Canada the right to due process under the law to apply for asylum. So essentially, we have a treaty in place that forces people who have to flee to make a very dangerous crossing. And right from the beginning of the first Trump administration, within weeks of the first Trump administration, a grandmother who was born in Ghana had been living in the United States froze to death in a ditch just south of Manitoba while trying to cross at night to visit her newborn grandchild in Toronto. It turned out later that she actually had the legal right to enter Canada under the Safe Third Country Agreement, but because no border authorities in Canada know about the details of that policy, she probably had called them and been told, no, you can't. So she does, and that was just the beginning. An average of 5 people per year die trying to cross the Canada-US border because the Safe Third Country Agreement forces them to get in a canoe or walk across a field in the snow or something like that. We are now in a situation where we could be facing tens of thousands of people trying to make these sort of crossings. And we could have a humanitarian tragedy on our hands as an out-of-date piece of law that the United States had insisted that we hold on to, continue to hold. The very name, the Safe Third Country Agreement, should give you a sense of the problem with this under Trump's America. It could be proven in court, even at this point, before things reach their full culmination, that people living in the United States who are asylum seekers currently have, to use the United Nations phrase, a well-founded fear of persecution within their country of residence. So the United States has gone from being a country of refuge, a troublesome one at that and a difficult one, to being a transit country that's going to be moving people on. And we have to be prepared for the danger of that. We don't want our border to be weaponized against innocent families who are trying to cross it. We don't want it to be weaponized against ourselves. We don't want it to be weaponized against Americans who are trying to get out, for that matter. So what can we do about this? We're not going to be in a position to get the Canada-US border back to a normal status. I mean, I'm one of many people who's been warned by the company I work for that if I need to cross the Canada-US border for work purposes, that I need to bring a burner phone without any apps or email on it and that sort of thing. I think almost anyone who works for a major company in Toronto has been told this. That's extraordinary. I've only done that before when going to Iran or China. Now I need to do it as a matter of policy when going to the United States. It's an unusual situation. There are things we can do in Canada. There are things our governments can do. There are things that the parties running to be the next government can do to make the border less weaponized. What should we ask? What should we ask our candidates? What should we ask our MPs? First of all, we need to get rid of the Safe Third Country Agreement. We need to recognize that the United States has become a dangerous place for some people living there, that and that it does us no good anymore. It serves us no benefit. We will have whatever refugee crisis we have or migration crisis we have. It's a question of whether that is one of processing a moderate number of people. It's not going to be hundreds of thousands. Or whether it's going to be having tens of thousands of people do something extremely dangerous that's going to kill some of them, cause them to lose their limbs, these sorts of things. Second of all, we need to remove other incentives that exist to make dangerous entries into Canada. We need to create limited humanitarian pathways for entering Canada. It's right now impossible for people seeking to get out of the United States who are not Americans to come to Canada without coming here and applying for asylum. We know from past practice that instead of tens of thousands of people coming across willy-nilly and dangerously, if we create a limited pathway where you can apply, not just for asylum, but possibly for labor migration, because a lot of these people who've made their way across 10 countries are skilled people, they're middle-class people, they're people with trades and so on. Creating labor pathways has worked, and we've done it during the last 10 years. So create safe, limited pathways to limit the size of the unsafe, illegal pathways. Enter new cooperative agreements with the other countries of Latin America and the Caribbean to share the burden of the people who are looking to cross borders. Most of our cooperative agreements about this have been mediated by the United States during the last 10 years. We need to start working with Mexico, with Central America, with South American countries, with Caribbean countries to find ways to share the burden for Canada to use migration to help development across there so the Canadian border doesn't become a wall and becomes a place of hope and opportunity. Finally, make it easier for those Americans who want to get out of their country and who see Canada as the better place for them to get here. It's surprisingly difficult for Americans seeking to get here. It's harder than it was during the era of war resistors in the 1960s and early 70s to come to Canada, to bring your family, to set up. We should have special programs for Americans as well, because they are also victims of this. And we don't want the border weaponized against them, against the Americans who see the good and would like to be part of our community. We don't want it weaponized against us, and we don't want it weaponized against the people who are stuck in between. And I think we can find a way to keep the border a place that Canada controls, not to keep people out, but for the benefit of the people of North America who need a place to live. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's better. Hello. It's lovely to be here in this beautiful church. I'm not sure I've ever actually been in this church because my late mother, Mildred, was a nurse for many, many years at St. Michael's, and she worshiped and went to Mass here at the cathedral behind us. And can I just say, she loathed Donald Trump. She would have been so sad that he outlasted Pope Francis. So with those thoughts of my delightful mother, I'll talk to you a little bit today about the plight of women in Trump's America and sort of how we can use that as a way of setting ourselves up in opposition to that. I'm kind of amazed that more people have not made this argument, but as a feminist and as somebody who just wrote a book about the illusion of gender equality, I'm actually not all that surprised. But there is one huge argument we can make for Elbows Up Canada, which is this. Are you a woman or a trans person or a non-binary person? Are you related maybe to a woman? Have you ever even met a woman? If the answer is yes to any of these questions, then you will know you do not want to be in Donald Trump's America right now, because the rights of women, trans people, and non-binary people are being rolled back at an astonishing rate. And the idea that we would ever want to be part of a country that treats more than half of its population in this disgusting way is astonishing to me. And nobody's really ever, I talked about it because I wrote a piece for The Star about this, but I don't think it gets said enough. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Trump's America. So I like to think, that Lincoln had a cabinet of rivals, and Trump has a cabinet of predators. He is surrounded by men who are credibly accused of sexual assault in his cabinet. He himself is, of course, a person who has been accused very credibly of assault by dozens of women over the course of his career. He has been found liable for sexual assault or rape, as the judge said, by a jury of his peers in a civil trial against E. Jean Carroll. He owes her more than $80 million for defaming her after she made these truthful allegations about him. So we know by who he chooses to surround himself with what he believes, what is in his heart. He's not Gloria Steinem, let's just put it that way. Who did he invite to the White House for St. Patrick's Day to talk about Ireland? He invited the disgraced fighter Conor McGregor, who was also found liable for sexual assault in Ireland. this is a group that relishes and, grows big on dominance and exploitation of people who are weaker than them, and of women, and of minorities, and of trans and non-binary people. And while this is all happening, they are also, of course, defunding support for sexual assault victims, for people who have survived domestic violence in the United States. And they're defunding healthcare initiatives that would help women, that would help families. They're defunding initiatives with anything with the word gender in them, in this sort of misbegotten war on DEI. I don't know why I'm doing this around DEI. DEI is fine. DEI is just fairness. DEI is just fairness in hiring and in our workplaces. He's also, of course, Donald Trump, surrounded by a group of pretty terrifying right-wing tech billionaires, the Broligarchy, as it's known. The Broligarchy, although it exists in an industry dominated by men, especially at the top echelon, seems to think that the reason for all of their problems are women. So Mark Zuckerberg gets out there and says that, we need more masculine energy in the workplace, even though about a quarter of people who work in the technology industry in Canada and the United States are women, and the number at the top are it's vanishingly small. Peter Thiel, another Trump supporter, has actually argued that the extension of suffrage, the extension of voting rights to women in America was one of the causes of kind of the moral decay of America. These are the people, this is the philosophy. They don't hide it, which is crazy to me. They don't even try to pretend. They want you to know this. They want us to feel afraid. They want to push women out of the workforce. Again, this is not hidden in any way. Just the other day, news broke that the Head Start program is being canceled, is going to be defunded in the United States. That's a program that allows lower income families to have childcare, to have child support, to have things like free breakfast and things like that. When that gets canceled and there is no more childcare for certain groups of people, do you know who's going to leave the workforce? The mothers of those children are going to leave the workforce, because that's the way we have structured our society. And of course, we see, the very glamorous women going off to space for 11 minutes, and God bless them. But, that is not, they were not astronauts. That is not space travel. And at the same time that was happening, NASA is scrubbing any reference to the historical work done by female astrophysicists, female astronauts from its websites. It is taking out any kind of policies in which girls are encouraged to pursue astrophysics or, robotics or things like that. So it really is an absolutely concentrated effort to remove women from leadership, from public view, from the workforce. Again, if it weren't so obvious, I think, am I being paranoid? But no, it's completely obvious. And they have this pronatalist policy where they want to have more babies, more white babies in America, but they don't want to do none of the things that would actually cause young people to want to have more children. Like, for example, having a daycare program, a national daycare program, or any kind of paternal leave, parenthood leave, maternal leave, or paternity leave. There is so little maternity leave in the States, it's ridiculous. I think there's a mandated 6 weeks if you're a federal worker in certain areas. Otherwise, you're on your own. Oh, it's shocking why more women don't want to have babies in a situation like that. Trans rights. I mean, we don't have, unfortunately, 6 weeks for me to stand here and talk about this, But the things that are happening to trans people are abominable. It's dehumanizing to say that you can't even have a passport with your, chosen gender identification on it is horrifying. Pushing trans people out of the army, they're going to push women out of the army. They've fired the highest ranking woman in the military, who was the head of the Coast Guard. They fired her with sort of no warning whatsoever, and she, I think, had 3 hours to leave her official residence. And then, of course, and I haven't even gotten to abortion, which is just a small part of, what feminists like to call reproductive justice. It's part of the continuum of women's health care and reproductive rights. Okay, so women are dying. We know this. Women are dying across America because they cannot adequately access health care during their pregnancies, because doctors are so afraid of doing something that seems wrong, that might be construed as an abortion in one of the 12 states that completely bans abortions, or the further 7 states, I think it is, that pretty much ban abortion because it's up to like a gestational age you wouldn't even know you were pregnant. So in almost half of America, like maybe 40%, you cannot access abortion care if you're a woman. And if you're a man who is in a heterosexual relationship, your partner can't either. And this means also that women who are trying to get other forms of health care can't have that either during their pregnancies. It's distressing and it's horrifying. And since 1988, we have lived in this country with women having the right across the country to safe access to abortion when they need it. You could argue that it's, patchy across the country, and some places are harder to, access than others, but nobody's going to tell you that you can't have it. Nobody's going to put a bounty on you like they do in Texas if you get an illegal abortion, or charge you if you're an abortion provider. And nobody's going to track your movements if you live in Idaho and you get tracked because you're leaving the state to go and access health care somewhere else. Anyway, this is all very distressing to me, and I hope to you as well. It's just an administration completely and utterly founded in misogyny. So why would we want to be part of this country when we could stay home and just watch The Handmaid's Tale on TV instead, or read about it in Margaret Atwood's 2 terrific books about that? So what do we do? How do we prevent that from happening here? How do we, leverage this as a way of showing how ridiculous this notion is? Well, I will start by saying I'm a little bit, we obviously are in a much, much better position, but also I have to say we have a federal election right now, which is a sausage party. I'm sorry, but it is, in which, we have no women leaders of any of the parties, and we have not had a woman run this country since 1993. I interviewed Kim Campbell, by the way, twice actually, and she gave me a quote that I loved, which is that if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And I'm afraid women's rights are on the menu in many parts of the world. So what can we do about it? I have 3 ideas for what we can do about it. One is we look out for the sort of the signs of creeping language and ideology that we see in the States. So when you hear Pierre Poilievre talk about anti-woke ideology, we have to ask what that means. What does that mean? Does it mean what it means in the States, which is that some people don't deserve to be in public life and don't deserve to have their history recognized? We could ask Pierre Poilievre, but he's not taking questions, so we'll see. The second ask is, I'm not letting Mark Carney off the hook here, because when he constituted his first cabinet, he got rid of the Ministry of Women and Gender Equality, which is actually huge. It really is. It did not create a lot of headlines, unfortunately, but it rippled through all the advocacy groups in this country who do the incredibly important work around women's health, around preventing domestic violence, all kinds of things. 400 of them have signed a letter asking for that ministry to be reinstated. And I hope if Mark Carney continues to be the Prime Minister, that he does reinstate that ministry, which does incredibly important work. Speaking of domestic violence, you can call upon the Premier of this province, Doug Ford. You can ask your MPP to pressure him to pass Bill 173, which is the act declaring intimate partner violence an epidemic, which it is, and it has been declared an epidemic in jurisdictions around the country, including in Toronto. The coroner's jury in Renfrew last year, when it was examining the murders of 3 women by one man who had been their partner, the first request they made was that Ontario declare intimate partner violence an epidemic. It would have cost them nothing. It would have just signaled that this is something we think is important, and it has not happened. And the third thing is ask your candidates where they stand on reproductive justice and reproductive health care. Where do they stand on so-called pregnancy crisis centers, which sometimes get federal funds, which are really just anti-abortion counselors in disguise. And then the last thing is really, so I was on tour with this book, which was about the illusion of gender equality. And I would say to people, the stories I heard kind of curled my hair, but I would say to people all the time, just talk about this. Just really talk about it. Talk about it to each other. Talk about it to your kids, especially. Like, do you know what your son is watching when he's in his bedroom? It doesn't have to be as bad as Andrew Tate. There's lots of terrible, terrible content out there. And we live in a world right now where young men are veering to the right in terms of who they're voting for in the Western world anyway. And they're questioning the goals of feminism and saying that it has gone too far. This is terrifying to me. So talk to your kids, talk to your neighbors, and because that is really the only way that we are going to together achieve what we want, which is a world more fair, more equitable, more equal for everybody. Okay, thank you.
So I think we'll move on to questions. Are you guys up for questions? Are you guys up for answering some questions? Yeah, okay. So we'll just have people line up if they have any questions. And if you guys don't mind coming up. And what we'll do is each question will be directed to one of them, just because we want to keep the meeting to an hour and a half. So don't have too much time for questions, but yeah, feel free to come up and ask one. And also, thank you very much. That was very great. And I wanted to say that it is a bit hard to follow all the overlapping storylines that are happening in the US right now. So it's really helpful to have 2 people talk about a specific field they know a lot about.
Just a question for Doug. I understand it takes 3 years for a refugee to get a refugee status or get through the process in Canada. Can you talk about why that is and what would be a way of shortening that?
I mean, it's partly because there are a lot of people applying for refugee status. Is this better? Okay. There's 2 ways to become a refugee in Canada. You can come to Canada physically and apply. It's the only way you can apply when you're here. Or you can be resettled as a government-assisted refugee, where you're brought over from a humanitarian crisis in another country and settled here. Both of those processes, along with all our other immigration processes, are very overloaded and understaffed at the moment. Canada has taken in large numbers of refugees from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, although we still have not taken in all of the people who work with us. As well, it has large numbers of people who were here doing the big uptake in the temporary foreign worker program in the post-pandemic years. A lot of those 2 million people, in their desperation to stay here, are turning themselves upon the refugee system, because many of them come from countries where you do have a well-founded fear of persecution and so on. We could reduce those wait times. So 3 years is small. It's in many cases much longer than 3 years. I mean, I'm trying to help people get out of Afghanistan who are still stuck there. And there are very few of the maybe 20-odd refugee streams that allow you to apply to come to Canada. There are very few that have waiting lists shorter than about 3 years. And this is for people who need to get out like this week. They have somebody from the Taliban trying to get them because they're unmarried women in their 20s and that sort of thing. Canada's doing things like not unifying families right now. I mean, let's put it this way. At the end of last year, when the government got freaked out about the political implications of the provinces overusing the temporary foreign worker and student programs, they shut off all the taps. And right now, almost all the streams are shut. So there's burdens on all the systems. Whoever's the next government, and I actually think either party is going to deal with this in fairly similar ways, because they're going to face the same sort of economic and bureaucratic realities, is going to have to deal with the fact that our system does not work for processing of people. And this is all before we face the prospect of a lot of people coming up from the United States, which could be happening very soon. We do not have the bureaucratic capacity for it. Our rules are full of perverse incentives that send people into the wrong paths, that send people into asylum systems when they could just be applying for a labor-related thing, and that makes it very hard to reunify families. I mean, 3 years to become a refugee, to get the rest of your even children and parents over can be 10, 12 years, that sort of thing. So we think of ourselves as a country of immigration, but we're actually not very good at doing immigration right at the moment.
I'm so happy to hear you, the two of you, speaking up about what's happening south of the border. I listen to a lot of online stuff coming from the States, and Thom Hartmann, I don't know if you know him. He's in the States, and a woman called up just today, and she said, "My neighbor just got picked up by ICE, and she's been gone for 2 days. I don't know where she is." And Thom Hartmann said, "Would you please email me and let me know, because I want to follow up on this." And he mentioned that about another woman that had been picked up in in the southern states, disappeared. Now, you mentioned that a possibility of the Trump administration creating a situation where they would cross the border and possibly come and take someone from our country. Now, what would happen, and is that possible?
Maybe we should take another couple of questions, but just very quickly, I was referring to the possibility that Trump will get angry at a politician in Canada or something like that, and in one of his after midnight moments will say, "We've got to arrest this politician in Canada," and send the troops up to do that. And although I think the US military is very principled and tends to be very progressive in its views, in its rank and file, I think by the time that order reached a level of the ranks where someone would say, "Stop, that makes no sense, we're not declaring war on Canada." By the time it reached that level of the ranks, something could have happened, an incident could have happened, and then we would be in a NATO type situation. So, I think the material threat to Canada involves a moment of anger or pique or temper from the president. It doesn't really matter what it's directed at. It's just a question of how long before someone says stop. I mean, Richard Nixon made lots of crazy orders when he was angry or drunk or whatever. He ordered them to make a list of all the Jews in the US public service and so on. Somebody very high in the ranks eventually always said, stop, we're not going to do that, disobey that order, please. In Trump's first term, the senior generals sent out word saying, if he late at night says launch a nuclear missile, please disregard that order, and so on. He has now fired and replaced the senior generals who are capable of resisting such orders and replaced them with people of his ilk. So it could be several steps down the ranks before sanity prevailed. That's all I meant.
Okay.
Let's take 3 more questions, and then we can consolidate them.
Sure. This is a question for Ms. Renzetti. Both of you, I thought they were terrific talks. Thank you. You know, the phrase, at the moment, united we stand, divided we fall, seems never more true than at the moment. And I think this applies to Canadians, but I think it also applies internationally. So I'm wondering if you have heard of international women's rights movement groups in Europe and in, you know, all across the world who are allying with the like-minded groups in the States.
Yeah, I think there's always, you know, there's a huge kind of international movements all the time, and we see this kind of solidarity, for example, with, it's interesting because it's almost always when terrible things happen to women in other parts of the world, like in Afghanistan, and then you will get, you know, Meryl Streep stand up and make a speech about it and things, and we will all agree that this is just reprehensible. And, you know, women's organizations speak out about it. I think, as Doug was alluding to, it's still quite seismically shocking for most of the world to realize that that corruption is happening, you know, in a country we thought had been kind of a leader in these kind of realms beforehand. To answer your question, there are all kinds of international, you know, Planned Parenthood is one, you know, the UN women's agencies, things like that do all kinds of amazing work. So yes, I think there is a concerted kind of effort, but things are happening so fast and they're being destroyed so quickly that it's hard to, I think, marshal forces. But I think you'll see a more concerted effort, and we've talked about the protests that are happening. So, you know, in those protests, you'll get people who are angry at the removal of women's rights to control their own bodies, as well as people who are worried about the status of migrants in their communities. And I think that's only going to grow. Yeah.
This is also for you, Elizabeth. So all last fall, as we watched reproductive rights just implode in the United States, I kept thinking, surely we're going to see a huge influx of American women coming here to seek reproductive health care. And I don't know how much of that has happened. I can only think that the demand is going to go up in the next while, and I'm just kind of wondering whether, and on the one hand, I guess, speaking for myself, I would actually, if I were in the position to do so, want to be reaching a hand across the border saying,
yeah,
we welcome American women to come and get the health care here that they cannot get at home. And I'm just wondering whether in the current climate, how much thinking there is going on about what kind of retaliation we might suffer as a country if in fact we decided to make a stand of that sort.
So we are already seeing what happens sort of on an intrastate level when, for example, a doctor in New York prescribes surgical abortion medication to a patient in another state, And in New York State, where that happened, the governor did, protect the doctor who was being accused of prescribing medication across state lines. The thing with the abortion question is, so a bunch of things are happening. Women are traveling out of state to access abortion. More women are accessing medicinal abortions rather than surgical abortions. But when we talk about, will they come up here to, what we have to remember is you would have to go to a private clinic for one thing. You couldn't go to a hospital because you don't have a Canadian health card. And the other thing is the vast majority of women who these laws are affecting and whose lives they're ruining are poor women, right? They're poor women, they're racialized women, they're women who are already on the margins. Wealthy women will always be able to access reproductive health care. They always have been, right? Even when it was illegal in the States and when it was illegal in Canada. The problem is you have, say you're a poor mother, you have 3 kids already. The majority, 2/3 of the women who access abortions in the States and in Canada are already mothers. You've got 3 kids at home you need to look at. You've got maybe 2 jobs. You don't have a lot of money in the bank. How are you going to get to Canada? This is the problem. So I do think there are lots of, I donated in 2020 in Mike Pence's name to Planned Parenthood. So you can all do that as well. You can donate to reproductive health and justice organizations in the States, and it might be a good time to do that.
Yeah, you can do the last question, but maybe just a quick answer. But yeah, you're good to do one more.
One more?
Yeah.
Okay. Going through my head are visions of an underground railroad for women. I'm of an age where I sat in every day at the Morgentaler trial, and I think we've been fighting for the very fragile rights of women my entire life. And what's disturbed me most recently are, and I hate saying this in a church, are the efforts of the Christian right in Canada to take reproductive and I think fundamental health care rights away from women, and to do so in subtle ways. Selective, prohibit the last year or the year before's motion to private members' bill to prohibit selective abortions, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just wondering, Elizabeth, it's not an easy conversation, but we keep fighting, right? We just keep fighting since we're born as women for our own autonomy and our agency and our ability to make our own decisions about our own bodies. But is there any sort of bigger area where, because the Christian right, of course, has taken over the United States as well, period. Everything is, especially the rights of women, are coming from there. And just wondering if there's any words of wisdom for how we fight back here.
I think you can learn by studying your enemies in the same way, like if you practice judo or wrestling or whatever, you study the movements of your opponent. And in the States, it has been, people think in 2022, oh my goodness, they overturned Roe v. Wade. How did that happen? How did that happen? They'd been working on it for 30 years. They'd been putting judges into courthouses. They'd been electing state legislatures. They'd been changing the laws in small ways until one of those laws made it to the Supreme Court, and then that allowed Roe to be overturned. They play the long game, and I think we, on this side of justice, as I like to think of it, have to also play the long game, be aware of what they're doing, look for those little wedge points. So the pregnancy crisis centers, the private members' bills, ask your MPs where they stand on this idea. Poilievre has said, we'll never touch abortion. It's okay, but would you allow one of your backbenchers to move, to table a bill that says something along these lines? We have to look at, is access expanding or is it contracting as we have healthcare cuts? So these are all things I think we need to keep our eye on. The anti-choice movement is international, it is well funded, and it feels emboldened right now. So I think just keeping an eye on the long game and not letting any incremental damage happen to our rights is what we do. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, guys. We now have one announcement from, just got to pull up the name, Patricia. And while Patricia's coming up, John Sewell has actually sent me an announcement to read on his behalf. So I will do my best John Sewell impression. While we are concerned about the attack on democratic institutions in the United States, we need to pay attention to what is happening here in Ontario. Democratic practices in Ontario, particularly the idea that decisions are made by a majority of those elected, are being subverted. Premier Doug Ford introduced Regulation 530/22 under the Municipal Act on April 9th to extend strong mayor powers to another 169 municipalities in Ontario. He allowed just 7 days for comment. On April 16th, the power regulation was approved by cabinet meeting in private, and the powers are effective on May 1st. Premier Ford moved quickly because he knows that destroying this basic element of democracy would be widely opposed. Strong mayor powers mean that the local mayor and 1/3 of the council can approve anything deemed to be a provincial priority, as well as any other local matters. The opinions of 2/3 of the elected members of council mean nothing. Premier Ford has ended the basic democratic principles in municipalities that majority rules. Some might consider him Captain Canada, but this is not the kind of Canada we want to live in. What is a provincial priority that a few councillors can approve over the objections of a majority? Major infrastructure projects such as Highway 413, the tunnel under the 401, and the Bradford bypass. Maybe even spending $2 billion on a private spa where Ontario Place once proudly stood. New low-density suburban housing on farmland. High-rise buildings in places that are inappropriate. The best we can do is protest loudly. Write your MPP with a copy to Premier Ford and make it clear you want this destruction of a basic democratic principle reserved. Unfortunately, I will not be able to answer questions on this, but sounds like quite an initiative, so yeah. And we also have set up a number of all-candidate meetings. We're running a bit behind schedule, so we're gonna post them on our website, but a number of ridings in Toronto, we have all the candidates coming out, just a chance for people to get to speak directly to those candidates. And then, yeah, I'll pass it off to you for an announcement. And if you could keep it to a minute, that'd be amazing.
Okay, so I'm Patricia. Can you hear me? Oh, that's better. So I live at Coxwell Danforth neighborhood, and on our street, I guess we kind of think in a time of a huge crisis, we should think really small, and that's why we have created our own little Elbows Up group for our street. We call it Woodrow Avenue Elbows Up. Grassroots all the way. And since it's kind of icky to maybe try to do this, we came up with a how-to. And there are some copies of it at the back. You can take a photo of it if you like, because there are not a ton of copies, but it just is a good way to do it, and really we should have them all across Canada.
Thank you very much. So we don't have live music tonight, so we're going to save the music till the end. Just saying that to the people at the back who are going to play the music right now. So we'll save that because we do all want to have the time to listen to John Ralston Saul and have a chance to ask him questions. So I'd like to introduce John Ralston Saul. He is an award-winning essayist and novelist, a longtime champion of freedom of expression. He was the elected president of PEN International from 2009 to 2015. He's a leading voice in the international movement supporting immigrants and refugees, and as he pointed out to me, he is an author. He has, one of his most influential books has been a book called Fair Country, and it talks truths about Canada. So without any further ado, welcome John.
Evening. Whoops. Do I have to move this up? Can you hear me? Is that all right? Yes? Okay, great. You know, on 28th of March, a few weeks ago, the second most powerful man in the world, I think his name is Vance, went with his wife to Greenland to watch the dogs race. And it follows naturally that the National Security Advisor went with them. This is probably the first time in history that two of the most powerful people in the world went to another country, not on a holiday, but out of their sincere and deep interest for dog races. And Trump insisted that they'd been invited. The Prime Minister of Greenland insisted they had not been invited, and said that it was a highly aggressive move. I forget if it was Vance or Trump said that they were there to defend against the Chinese Communist Party interfering in Greenland. And then Trump said more seriously, we're going to get it one way or the other. So why am I telling you this story? I've always been a fan of the surreal movement. I mean, this is beyond comedy. This is surreal in the real 1920s, 30s sense. It's dark comedy. It's humor of the darkest possible sort. And of course, it's also, I'm describing, a dry run for the Canadian Arctic. Sometime, I don't know exactly when, I would think that you'll find American leaders, something will happen, they'll start talking a lot about Chinese ships and Russian ships using the Northwest Passage, and then they'll say, well, we better send American ships, and then there'll be a reason for American ships to put down anchors, and then for people to come ashore, and well, if you come ashore, you've got to sleep, so then they'll build some sort of camp. That's actually called an invasion, but it'll all be done, you know, as if nothing were happening, as if it were perfectly normal. And I would say that within a decade, we could lose about half of Canada, quite easily. It's really that close. And Greenland, even though really was fascinating for Canadians that a population of somewhere around 60,000 Greenlanders outsmarted the Vice President of the United States and his wife and the security advisor. So I suppose we should be able to do it too, but maybe the Americans have learned, so when they come, they'll be more serious about how they do it. I don't know, but we have to be ready for the fact that they're going to come. Why? Well, I think first, you know, we have to, I think what the two of you are saying is so true and so disturbing, but we have to also think to ourselves very seriously about what the American elite, whether it's political or business or bureaucratic, says to itself or in dinner parties, says quietly to itself, does papers in the Pentagon on. I was once in the Pentagon. It's an astonishing place. They do talk among themselves a great deal. And I think that my belief, and from all the research that I've done over the decades, I think it's fair to say that a large portion of the US elite has always rejected the idea of Canada's existence. It has never been accepted. It's always been there, as sort of locked up because of deals we've done. You know, the principal job of the Canadian Prime Minister is to somehow figure out how to keep the Americans off our back. That's the number one job of every Canadian Prime Minister for almost 200 years. So it's always been there, and periodically this idea of the US elite is unlocked, and then we have a crisis, and it has happened before. And Trump has now unlocked the safe and brought out these ideas. Why has he done this? Well, you know, in part, the fundamental reason is because we have this gigantic natural wealth. We're just so lucky. It's not because we're smart. We didn't do anything to get it. We're just really lucky. We're one of the richest countries in the world when it comes to every form of natural wealth. The second reason is that, there's a fundamental philosophical idea which began before the American Revolution and is still there. And it is that when you use the word America, you're talking about North America. There is no such thing as the United States. It's America. It's one of the reasons that I try very hard never to talk about Americans or America, because it's their way of describing their ownership or their desire to own the entire continent. And the other reason that it's being brought up is it's a classic distraction when there's a mess at home. When there's a mess at home, you always talk about the next door country in order to get people to think about, well, there's a problem with Canada, as opposed to there's a problem with unemployment, or there's a problem with poverty, or there's a problem with bringing back poverty, or taking away women's rights. No, we're not taking away women's rights. There's a problem with Canada. And so when Trump started talking that way, it was about laying the groundwork for there being a problem with Canada. He'll see how far he wants to take it. Now, I want to add to that a thing we don't say often enough, which is the United States is theoretically a democracy. There are votes. It has always been a profoundly fragile democracy. Remember that it's something like 70 or 80% of its exports were slave-based products until the 1870s, slave or former slave production until something like the 1870s or 80s. Until the 1960s, the economy was to a great extent built on the leftovers of a slave-based built society. It's always been a society from the very beginning, because of the way it revolted against the British, which turned inwards. With the Second World War, they were attacked, they were forced into it, and they had to turn outwards. That's not their natural tendency. They're an inward-looking country, except in terms of control or power over the Americans. So, as a result of the war, they went on and were part of international alliances against communism, and now that's over. And so now, without that kind of anti-Nazi, anti-communist drive, they're going back to the old model, which goes to the beginning of the United States, up until the Second World War, which is the desire to turn inwards and to dominate the Americas. And if he survives the midterms, I mean, some people say if there are midterms, I think there will be. I'm not sure there'll be another real presidential election, but there'll be an election of some sort. If he survives the midterms, then the threat to democracy in the United States will become very real. And I do think that it just has to be said again and again and again, that Supreme Court decision to remove controls on political funding is the single most important decision that, apart from a coup d'etat, which could have been made in any country, but in the United States, to take it down the road away from anything that could be called real democracy. So they're already chipping away at what could be called serious democracy. And in that context, my belief is that after the midterms, the threat to Canada will be revived and activated in a serious way. I'm usually pretty bad on dates. I'm usually very good on what's going to happen, and I usually get the dates wrong. But so, I think it's going to happen. I think it's after the midterms. I'm probably wrong about the second part. But here's the thing. When Trump says all these loopy things, all these nutty things he says, he can't stop talking, right? He's got logorrhea. He sits down every day and he just talks. I mean, Caesar does not do that unless he's certifiable. There's a serious problem. He just sits there and he says all this stuff, and when he can't think what else to say, he just keeps talking. But everything that he says, there's something serious in it, even though it is loopy. And so when he talks about the southern border, even though it was nonsense what he says, he's serious about it. When he attacked Trudeau, when he talked about the governor, that was all serious undermining of the idea that Canada is a real place. And I've written a lot about Mussolini. You'll forgive me. I used to do a lot of research. It was in a number of my books. And as soon as in the second term, everything Trump does reminds me of Mussolini. I mean, Mussolini is not like Hitler. I mean, they're both awful people, but Mussolini is much more interesting as a political figure, much more complicated in a way. But at the heart of Mussolini is the fact that he was a bully. What's a bully? A bully is somebody who picks on people who's weaker than they are. Why do they pick on people who are weaker than they are? Because they're a coward. So I've just summarized what I think about Mr. Trump. He's a bully, which means he's a coward. On the other hand, he's managed to get control of the biggest force, military force in the world, which means that even a bully who is a coward can be extremely dangerous. And we've seen, as we saw with Mussolini, and I could give you other historic examples, bullies in power are incredibly dangerous if they have armies. So how do we prepare ourselves for the situation which I think is coming? Well, I think the first thing we have to do is, in a non-nationalistic, a non-romantic way, we have to clarify to ourselves how we think about ourselves. And we have to do it in a kind of very matter-of-fact way, so that when we're dealing with the world, we know exactly who we are and the way to talk. We are, I mean, I'm going to say some things which are so silly. We are the second biggest country in the world. We are a very old, stable democracy. We're one of the oldest stable democracies in the world. We are the oldest continuous democratic federation in the world. It's a terrible sentence. We are the oldest continuous democratic federation in the world. The United States is not continuous. They blew themselves up with the Civil War. Since 1848, we've been working on what we're doing. We're a very peculiar experiment, not based on the Euro-US mythological model of one people, one culture, one language. Instead, the whole country's based on living with complexity, incredible complexity, building the country on a triangular foundation of indigenous, francophone, and anglophone, and that produces then a Métis nation, which we recognize in the Constitution. And then on top of all of that foundation, layer upon layer of newcomers come and shape the country, increasing. Every layer comes and there's a new shape to the country based on that foundation. So this celebration of complexity, no other democracy in the world celebrates complexity. They're trying to produce simplicity. Oh, this is what we are. And Canada says, when the Canadians ask, well, it's really complicated. How much time do you have? And at the same time, as I said, we're lucky. We have minerals, unbelievable. We have so many trees. We have so much oil and gas. We're so lucky. And we're still saying to ourselves, we have this small population. We don't have a small population. There are 41 million of us. That's a big population. We have the 8th biggest population of the 32 Western-style democracies. So we have a big weight in terms of the people, well-educated people, middle-class people largely. We have one of the highest standards of living in the world, above the USA, one of the highest life expectancies, much higher than the USA. We have a pretty decent system of public education, and our elites do not come out of the private schools. The private schools produce mainly stockbrokers, as far as I could make out. But the government's run largely, the government, the civil service, the ambassadors are run by people out of the public school system. You know, my wife was Governor General, comes out of the public school system. I come out of the public school system. Who went to a private school here? You don't have to answer. Anyway, so I just want to say, in spite of all of this, in 1988, we had a big drama, a big election, and we decided to change the direction of the country. We had always had a policy which was based on how can we sell as much as possible to the United States but keep as big a distance from the United States as possible. Very difficult. Our prime ministers have always been, that's why I've always said that the characteristic of a Canadian prime minister is you have to be hypocritical, you have to know how to lie, you have to, all these things. Otherwise you couldn't keep the Americans on side without getting too deeply in bed with them. So we inverted our direction and decided to integrate our economy into the United States. And now, 4 decades later, the United States, with the rights of a great power, has decided to change directions and has gone back into 19th century nationalism. So here we are, stuck, because we decided to integrate, and they've just said, oh, well, tough titty, you know? You do what you can. I mean, we're not there for you now. And so here we are in an existential struggle to rediscover the idea of diversity, political diversity, which dominated Canada from the 1850s to 1988. So the question is, can that be done? Can we actually find our way back into international diversity, into complexity? A way not to get out of the American market, we got to keep as much of that as we can finagle, but can we get ourselves into as complicated a situation as possible at the international level? Yeah, we can do it. It's going to be a hell of a lot harder than it would have been in '88, which is what people like me were for, but it can be done. And frankly, a lot of countries out there, a lot of regions, a lot of organizations, multinational organizations, are going to be looking for reliable allies in the Americas. It pretty well comes down to us. Maybe Mexico. We should be doing a lot more with Mexico. A lot more with Mexico. A lot of people are looking to be allied with people who are rich in resources, stable, trustworthy, a stable democracy, a middle-class model, comfortable with the reality of linguistic and racial complexity. It's one of the things we're best at, which so many countries are struggling with, and we don't even have really a lot of laws about it. We just sort of, stumble along, and we figured out how to make it work. And a strong public education system, and a strong public health care system. Don't listen to the voices from the private sector coming in from the United States who are trying to trick us into bringing in a two-tiered healthcare system. 5 minutes in England will tell you why that doesn't work. The rich go to the private, and the others go to the public. So what I've been describing are the qualities which can carry us internationally, but we have to beware that some of our leaders, I don't know how many, but some of our leaders are going to lose courage as they lose the comfort of reliance on the United States. They haven't quite gone to bed long enough to realize what's happening and how difficult it's going to be for them. They're so used to going to a meeting in New York and then to their house in Florida. It's so much more complicated. They might have to learn another language. They might have to go to countries across seas and do deals. Fortunately, we have a lot of newer, a couple of generations old, for example, in South Asia and East Asia, who can help us rebuild our economy in other parts of the world. And I think they will take the lead, not the old Bay Street crew, who will be more and more of a problem in the short run. So we mustn't listen to the people who want us to sacrifice our strengths in order to re-seduce Washington, in order to save money, in order to be more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. If we falter, if we show weakness, the United States, frankly, will gobble us up. We're at that period. 30 years ago, it wasn't that kind of time. This is a different time. It's out of the box now. They will gobble us up. If we show confidence, then the best in the United States will embrace us and stand up with us, not as friends, but as allies. Countries don't have friends, they have allies. And we will be able to build new alliances. It'll be an enormous task. It's a gigantic task. And if there are people here who are under 40, I think this is your life. This is the rest of your life. This is the next 40 to 50 years, just as it was 40 years to get us to where we are now. The problem that we're in now, it's 40 to 50 years to get us out of this problem. It will be the drama of your lives. But I think these gatherings, this is really, after a long weekend, this is not a bad turnout, after all that food and drink. If people are still vertical enough to get here and sit down and stay, everyone's awake. It's amazing, all that food. So these gatherings show me that a lot of people want to engage, that it's happening all over the place. And we just have to keep reminding ourselves and telling particularly younger people who are discovering public life, like you, in a way, for the first time, even though you may have discovered it through your parents, that it's incredibly boring part of the time. It's incredibly rough and tumble. Nobody thanks you. Everybody insults you. It's endless. On the other hand, it's pretty exciting when you're standing for a great cause. It may not be easy, but it is rewarding. And frankly, for the people who are just starting down this road, I envy you. Thank you very much. Whatever.
We want to get everyone out by 8:30, so maybe 2 questions, relatively quick ones, if possible.
None? All right. Yes, there's one there.
I hope I'm not naive, but an idea was floated that Canada could be an important ingredient in allies with Europe to form a powerful force of 400 million people. There was a mention of a shared border somewhere in the Arctic that might give us route to NATO. Do you think such an alliance is really what it would take to stand against the America and maybe the power of Asia, so that there's a balance?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, after really from Pierre Trudeau on, there have been governments in Canada which have tried to strengthen our political and economic relationships with Europe. And we have all sorts of deals which are either done or almost done. Some of them need to be go through some parliaments, but they're basically on the road. If Canada showed we really wanted them, they would have been through. There's no question that we have a whole pile of elements which Europe does not have. So we are a very logical partner for the EU. It doesn't mean we should turn our back on the States. As I say, we should sell every bloody, shoe or hat or whatever we can sell to them without giving up anything. And the only way we can not give up anything is by having alternate markets so that they can't back us into a corner. So I think it's incredibly important that we, and I thought, and we're in an election, so I don't want to sound like I'm in an election, but I thought it was very smart when Carney became Prime Minister that the first thing he did was get on an airplane and go to Paris. He didn't, as in the Canadian tradition, go to London. He went to Paris. Why did he go to Paris? Because the President of France is a key player with Germany in the EU, and the British, having been idiots, are no longer in the EU. And everybody smart in Britain knows that was the stupidest move they'd made since the Second World War. And so he basically began the negotiation for a new kind of Canadian relationship with Europe. So he's already thinking that far ahead. If he gets in as Prime Minister, he'll take it the rest of the way. Then, of course, he had to go to London, and the British Prime Minister had to see him and not treat him the way British Prime Ministers normally treat Canadian Prime Ministers, because he'd been seen and hugged on the steps of the Élysée Palace in front of the cameras, hugged by the President of France, a new Prime Minister. I mean, it's difficult for me to explain, but when the French Prime Minister hugs a foreign leader in public, it means something. It's a statement of intent, not sexual. And so there's a lot that we could do with Europe, and I think there's a lot we could do with South Asia, and I think there's an enormous amount we can do with Mexico and Latin America. But we have to radically change the kind of feeling in our Foreign Affairs Department, in our Finance Department, all these departments where they really have been trained for so long to think that United States 1, China 2, and Europe, well, very complicated. Yeah, it is complicated. What's the matter with that? What's the matter with complicated? Get on with it. And we have a big civil service, and we have people who are well trained, and they can do it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And maybe one last little piece. The EU is burdened with thousands of years of conflict and tensions and dimensions, whereas Canada comes in and could be that grease in the gears to formulate something. I mean, the era of Canada as a peacemaker in the world. Maybe we have a special place that others would have trouble matching.
Yeah, I don't think it's peacekeeping, but it might be, how do you talk about these things? How do you negotiate these things? I mean, I don't know about you two, but I mean, I've been in endless conversations in Europe, trying to explain to usually older, powerful people how you deal with certain kinds of problems that have to do with language and cultures and races and borders and things like that, how a Canadian would approach it. And you just see their eyes going kind of wobbly, and they just don't know how to deal with the ideas that you're putting forward. But I think there are a lot of younger people in Europe who are coming up who talk. When we're in Europe, we hear them talking about how Canada is a very interesting example. So I think there is a role we could play, and particularly at a time when on their borders they've got a number of problems. But remember, the areas where they have problems are also areas where we know something. Like, we know a lot about those problem areas. We have a lot of Canadians from those problem areas who are interested and go back and have families and so on. So I think we could have a fascinating role to play, but we have to really say, okay, we're redoing the numbers. It's no longer USA #1. It can be in the top 5. You know, and we're going to try and do Europe as #1, and then we'll break that down, because there's the EU, but then there are all these different countries and different possibilities. We have never done this at the really serious level. Now's the time.
Thank you. You give me hope.
Thank you. We have one more person waiting, and that's our last question for this evening.
Hi.
Hi. I was born in Chile, and I came to Canada as a refugee.
sorry?
I was born in Chile.
Right.
And I came to Canada in 1975.
Right.
After the coup in Chile.
Yes.
What's going on in the U.S. right now seems like a coup. I'm hearing other people calling it a coup. Would you do that? Would you call it that?
Well, you see, I mean, I said that I think that by the midterms it'll be clear. I think what happened in Chile, I mean, I've been quite a bit in Chile, and, I know exactly what happened there, etc. After all, Chile was one of the most stable countries in Latin America, and so it shouldn't have happened, right? But I think that there have been a series of steps in the United States which lead towards the death of serious democracy. I think that what remains of American democracy is incredibly fragile. And I do think that law, that the decision by the Supreme Court on funding was one of the most important negative decisions that could be made. And you start going through, you can make a very long list which indicates the decline of the United States as sort of a democracy. Can they turn the corner and bring it back? I like to be optimistic. That's why I said maybe if by the midterms they can, if decent people can win the midterms, there's a fight that can be fought. But if they can't win the midterms, then I actually think it's over. I don't know what form the decline will take. I think it will be violent. With that many guns and the country so divided, I think there will be increasing violence. There may indeed be another civil war, not necessarily in the shape of the first one. They're already close to a civil war when you look at the levels of political violence in the country. And just when you have that many guns and that profound division in political beliefs and such ideological beliefs, and that would be my last comment, which is wherever you have ideologues, you're on the edge of people shooting guns and killing people. So what's always been good about Canada, almost always, we've had our little moments of horror, is that we've always managed to what's the right way? fudge our way through the worst moments, with the exception of the Riel Rebellion and the Japanese arrest during the Second World War. We haven't had too many moments which are and of course the mistreatment of Indigenous people for not as long a period as one thinks, because actually we had a partnership with Indigenous people for about 350 years before we betrayed it. And now, thanks to the Supreme Court, we're putting it back together again. There was a lot of suffering, but it's being put together again, and it will happen. All my Indigenous leader friends are confident that it's happening, because about 30 times they've gone to the Supreme Court, and since what, the 80s or 90s, and every single time the Supreme Court rules against the Canadian government or the provincial governments and for the Indigenous people. This is the best thing that could have happened for Canada. And I mean, there'll be maybe 5 or 10 more, and we have to humiliate totally the belief of the Canadian governmental system that they have certain kinds of power vis-a-vis Indigenous people. The Indigenous people are going to play an enormous role in building this country up to the highest level. And they're ready to do it. I talk to young Indigenous leaders. They're just dying to get at it. The Inuit leaders are fantastic, for example, just fantastic. I think the most exciting young leaders in Canada are Indigenous. Sorry for everybody else, but there you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for staying and listening to our wonderful speakers. So our next meeting will be on May the 5th. The details will come up on our website. We'll have our speakers and location announced for May the 5th, but that's our next meeting. And I think, unless Theo has anything to add, we are going to end with O Canada, and we have our organist ready to go. Thank you very much.